Hi everyone, this is Lisa, and welcome to this module on caregiving and the older adult. Here are our objectives for this module. We're going to describe the role families and other informal caregivers play in the delivery of healthcare to older adults. We're going to discuss financial, social, and emotional impacts to informal caregivers. And finally, we're going to explore the role of formal versus informal caregiving. So, informal caregiving, or caregiving provided to the older adult by family and friends, is big business in the U.S. Despite the myth that all disabled or frail older adults reside in nursing facilities, the fact is that 90% of that care is given by informal caregivers. Your book puts forth the estimate that 34.2 million informal caregivers are providing services, which is more than 10% of the entire U.S. population. Right now, the ratio of potential caregivers to potential needy, frail older adults is around 7 to 1. But as the U.S. continues to age, and as Maine continues to age, this ratio is expected to decrease over the next several decades until it hits a 3 to 1 ratio in 2050. Of course, the implication for this is that older adults in the near future, 2050 is not that far away, will have less support from their informal circle. Now, those caring for an older adult report they spend about 20 hours a week performing this service, and this is very often on top of other family and employment obligations. So caregivers often report that their role is both a rewarding and stressful one, and it really isn't hard to see why. As I mentioned earlier, caregiving the older adult is only one responsibility these folks are juggling. Very often they are also working outside the home and parenting their own children. They are also very often flying blind when trying to provide care. An older adult often has many needs the informal caregiver can be ill-prepared to provide, such as mobility needs, nutritional needs, as well as dealing with the really challenging behavioral problems such as wandering that occur in the population with dementia. And getting needed information or resources to assist can be tough. The person providing informal care will often prioritize the older adult's needs at the expense of their own, meaning needed care is overlooked and contributes to caregivers' reports of ill health and mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety resulting from informal caregiving. And we got to remember that informal caregivers of older adults are often spouses and adult children who are very often older adults themselves, with all of those implications. And on top of the health and emotional impacts, informal caregiving has a big economic impact both on the individual caregivers and society at large. Informal caregivers are generally providing their services free of charge. And their collective estimated value of this is $470 billion, and that's billion with a B, yearly. This is a cost that's not considered in the estimates of future long-term care costs in this country, which is kind of scary when you consider the drastic drop in the informal caregiver ratio we are soon facing. It also can create financial difficulty for the caregiver, especially as the older adult's care needs increase. It's not uncommon that a caregiver would need to reduce their work hours, for example, or leave the workforce altogether in order to continue providing care at the level the older adult needs. About 20% of caregivers report their finances have taken a hit as a result of doing this work. Now, despite the problems inherent in the model, there are benefits to it. Both older adults and their caregivers report a greater sense of autonomy and control over the care arrangements of the older adult, as well as less anxiety that the care provided is substandard, as can be the case sometimes in an understaffed nursing facility. So clearly the need for caregiver support is both very needed and very difficult to come by. Ideally, these ventures would be considered by the U.S. on the federal policy level, but the fact is that the last major initiative to address the problem was in 1993 with the passage of the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. FMLA gives very narrow targeted support, primarily designed as a bridge or for acute needs and only over a short period of time. In a nutshell, a person with a qualifying reason, usually to care for a direct family member, spouse, child, or parent, can take up to 12 weeks of unpaid time for their work in order to provide that care before they need to worry about losing their job. Another national initiative is the National Caregiver Support Program, a grant-based program that provides federal money to states and territories to provide services as they see fit to their older population. This is an amendment to the Older Americans Act that we talked about earlier in the semester. Now, on the state level, there are a number of supports caregivers can access, and I put a link in your module folder to the DHHS page and a couple others that summarizes them. Respite for Maine is a pilot program started in October of 22 that aims to provide direct money to caregivers for assistance with needs that aren't covered by other services or for which the recipient may not be eligible. It's for a max of $2,000, which obviously won't go far in covering the cost of care, but allows the caregiver to other costs, such as short-term respite care services. The state respite care program is a state-funded program that is specifically targeted to Maine caregivers for an adult with a dementia-causing illnesses such as Alzheimer's disease. And the state also does provide for remuneration of informal caregivers through the Maine Elderly and Adults with Disabilities Waiver, which provides money directly to the older adults so they can choose to pay an informal caregiver. The criteria for this is fairly strict. The older adult must meet Medicaid criteria as well as need nursing home level of care in order to participate in the program. So obviously, the majority of care given to older adults is via informal, unpaid caregiving, but that does not obviate the need for formal care sometimes. As opposed to informal caregivers, formal caregivers have had education and training in this field and receive pay for the services rendered. And even with 90% of care being provided by informal caregivers, it's estimated that about 70% of adults over the age of 65 will require the services of a formal caregiver at some point in their lives. Most of the direct caregiving workforce are paraprofessional staff, such as certified nursing assistants or personal care aides, and long before the recent crisis, staffing these jobs was tough. Often these caregivers receive very low compensation, especially relative to their level of responsibility. The work hours are very often shifting, unpredictable, and as well as a lack of health, retirement, and vacation benefits that come with a lot of these jobs. There's also very little opportunity for advancement or increasing skill level within the roles for those who would make a career of it. While these formal caregivers can be employed directly by the families needing services, more often than not, they work through various agencies under the home and community-based services model. These are generally state-run, sometimes private services, and their eligibility criteria is usually income-based and often Medicaid funded. The idea behind them is that it is cheaper and more beneficial to older adults to provide care in the home than in long-term care facilities. And while it does seem to be true that in-home care often works out better for the individual older American, the overall cost-saving claims have yet to hold up to close scrutiny, and there's ongoing data gathering around that. So that is the end of this overview of caregiving and the older adult. Thank you for your attention.